Okay, thanks again to Nicole Capretz, Joe LaCava, William Powers, and Matt, whose last name I am not aware of, but for joining us today. We're going to be talking about climate and the franchise fee agreement discussions at the city. So Matt and Nicole, why don't you guys take it away at the outset?
Great. Thank you, Matthew. Good morning. I'm Matthew Vasilakis, co-director of policy at Climate Action Campaign. With us today is San Diego City Council member Joe LaCava, Bill Powers, principal of Powers Engineering, and Nicole Capretz, executive director at CAC. Thank you for allowing us to share our perspective on why these franchise agreements are a once-in-a-generation opportunity to finally put the city back in the driver's seat on these multi-billion-dollar real estate contracts and show that we are ready to start acting like a big city and be a leader on the world stage. We really appreciate the board's first editorial, making clear that these agreements are a moment for the city to step up. And that's because historically, SDG&E has been in charge of these contracts and have set the terms. Despite their extraordinary profits, they earn without paying any fees. As you know, we San Diegans pay their fees. They have also perpetually violated the contract terms, acting like they own the streets, and it's their right to do what they want instead of it being a privilege, which is what it is. And they know that they do that while charging us the highest rates in the continental United States, with more rate increases being discussed as we speak. So these one-sided agreements undermine our trust in government. They perpetuate the idea that the city is not able to manage large real estate contracts, and they put corporate interests over public interest. So what can we do? We have an easy answer. The city must not lock itself into long-term deals with SDG&E. The city needs time to explore its options and to ensure that SDG&E is actually going to comply with the contract. A short-term deal coupled with annual audits is the only way to ensure accountability and put the city back in charge. It also gives the city needed flexibility to pivot as technologies advance and our needs change, and it helps rebuild trust in City Hall. We can go into more details and are definitely happy to answer any questions. I'm happy to start the conversation here and get things going.
Thanks, Matt. Are the rest of you guys going to have some introductory remarks too, or do you want us to forge ahead?
Forge ahead.
Forge ahead.
Okay. Let's talk about the length of the contract. Obviously, that's something that you just talked about, Matt. And Joe, as a council member, you have a vote in that. SDG&E says they want 20 years for stability, that it helps them economically, that it will help the city and therefore its ratepayers. There are other areas, LA among them, where the terms have been for 5 years. So when you say a short term, what is the magic number for you, and what does SDG&E get wrong when they say they want 20 years?
Well, Matt, I think SDG&E as a for-profit company is going to assert what they want. And it's time for this city council and this mayor to assert the kind of leadership that I think San Diego families expect of us, and to be a tough negotiator and to control the conversation rather than simply deferring to a for-profit company. The SDG in itself has clearly stated that they have multi-year plans. I believe the CEO said they have a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan in terms of their outlook. So a 5-year plan, I think, actually comports nicely with SDG&E's plans. And keep in mind, we're just one portion of their entire coverage. So I don't see any problem with 5 years. And given the rapidly changing nature of the industry, 5 year gives us a chance to understand where the market's going, explore the option of public power, and gives them a reasonably well-defined timeline going forward.
What do you make?
As a follow-up, do any of you want to add anything to that? And I mean, San Diego knows wildfires very, very well. We know wildfire investment as a utility company very, very well. If they're going to shell out all this money for a world-renowned weather station, and let's be real, that's what it basically is. Why would they do that on a 5-year time horizon? Why wouldn't they want greater stability for 20? I guess I just want to press back on your 5-year window a little.
Bill, do you want to take that?
Yes. And in this case, and just a little background, professional engineer, energy systems. I do a lot of work representing nonprofits before the Public Utilities Commission. And one issue is geographic. most of those systems are not in the city limits of San Diego. And those systems are dealing with a fire hazard to the east. And so San Diego Gas and Electric will continue to put in those investments and operate those systems. The issue of long-term investment in the city, and specifically the city of San Diego geographic limits, what SDG&E is dealing with now isn't related to them needing to make 10 or 15 or 20-year investments. As I did listen to the interview that you had with SDG&E a few weeks ago, and it seemed a primary concern of theirs was their load is dropping, in part because of rooftop solar, batteries. That is the revolution that is happening in the energy system today. And we're not looking at SDG&E making major new investments in the system. We're looking to them to adapt to a changing dynamic where it's the customers that are going to be providing the energy supply. In fact, SDG&E or whoever is providing the service will be dropping back into more of a backup system over time. They don't need a long-term franchise agreement to serve in that role.
Thank you.
Right, so you might have seen in the interview that their argument to the longer agreement is in the same way that you're speaking on, kind of new technologies and pivoting to what the years ahead have. They also say that to make their investments and to make their changes, they need longer time too. So is that a fair argument? What do you say to that argument as far as the investments they're making?
Well, it's not a fair argument from the standpoint that I just laid out, but also I did listen to the interview and they weren't specific at all about what are these investments. They did mention drones for watching transmission lines in the backcountry. They weren't specific at all about what these major investments are that they say they need 10, 15, 20 years for. And to repeat, what the dynamic is, I was just reading an article in the paper this morning about the utilities focused on undercutting rooftop solar at the commission. They understand what is happening. It's not an issue of the utilities investing in needed long-term projects. It's an issue of the utility model being superseded by technology, which is individuals that can provide themselves with the same capabilities. And so that the planning will revolve around incorporating third parties, and I'm sure some of you have solar in your homes. Incorporating that technology is primarily a software issue. It's not, we have to put steel in the ground, which has been the utility model for a century.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add to that, as Matt mentioned, which Matt Hall. We have two Matts here. As Matt Hall mentioned, SDG&E, well, Sempra has a 5-year contract. It's SoCalGas, their sister company under the umbrella of Sempra, in LA County, and they're doing just fine. And you've heard of zero challenges with investments that they need to make sure that their gas lines are running safely and reliably. So I think it's a red herring. And getting to Councilmember LaCava's point, I mean, of course, they're going to try to assert that they need long-term contracts because this is a huge moneymaker for Sempra. I mean, in fact, it's one of their largest profitable industries, these regulated utilities. And so, of course, they want to lock it in. The problem is the climate crisis is barreling down and we have to completely pivot and decarbonize our energy system. We just cannot afford to be connected to this corporation that has, consistently, persistently undermined kind of this clean energy, decentralized distributed future. It's just not in the interest of San Diego. And frankly, that's exactly why we launched San Diego Community Power. I was before many of you when the whole debate was happening over San Diego Community Power. As you know, Sempra invested millions of shareholder dollars to fight that. They did not want to lose control. They wanted full monopoly over both procurement and distribution, and we won. But this is trench warfare. Like Bill said, this whole energy model is changing before their very eyes, and suddenly they don't have this, necessarily guaranteed tsunami of cash coming in, and so they're going to fight back. But I think it's incumbent on our mayor and council to sort of say, hey, again, if we look at what we need to do to be climate safe and climate ready and prepare the next generation for a world that I think none of us know what's going to look like. Frankly, it's very scary. The more the data comes in from Scripps, the scarier it gets. Like due to that, like unknown future, we absolutely need to make sure that the city has the flexibility to pivot and be ready. So that's kind of what I would say.
How would shorter contracts affect rates, and could rates be brought down at all? Do you have ideas about that?
Well, at the onset, I wouldn't expect it to have any implications to the rate structure. Again, we're one portion of their total coverage, so we don't expect there to be any changes of that. Again, as others have said, they're negotiating in public for what they want. I have no doubt that if we assert ourselves, we can secure a 5-year franchise agreement and begin to move forward in the conversations of what San Diego's future looks like. But I don't expect there to be any changes in the rates. As you know, they're already the highest around, and I would hate to think that we're going to even be looking at more. And I think one of the few times that the the California Public Utilities Commission, is actually going to be understanding of that. So I don't expect there to be any changes in rates when we agree to a 5-year extension.
And I guess well, maybe, but in a good way, which I think is what you're getting at. Like, is this maybe a window of opportunity to sort of change the trend line? Because the trend line is just going up. In fact, they have a rate proposal that, well, they just got a rate increase recently, and they have another one in that would, according to the data, go up 28%. Our rates will go up 28% from today by 2023. Are you kidding me? This is a company making $1 million a day for the privilege of using our streets in profit. That's not revenue. That's after they paid their executives, after they paid their workforce. $1 million a day. Our rates are going up 23%? No way. I mean, this is just a boondoggle. And so at some point, we have to stop the bleeding. And I believe that if the city asserts itself and establishes a 5-year deal, they're changing the whole mindset, frankly, of like, who's in charge here? And like, whose interests are being like put first? And I believe the city would take a new role at the PUC. They've sort of taken a back seat on almost everything related to these contracts and frankly, our energy system. Again, the San Diego Community Power is a new model, a new day, and this very exciting where we're headed. But now it's time for the city to assert itself at the PUC when these outrageous rate increases are being proposed. They need to invest the time and resources to stand up and say, this is unacceptable. Because I think it would signal to SDG&E, look, you're on notice. You have a 5-year contract. Are you going to pivot in terms of how you have your relationship dynamic with the city, and thus go to the PUC maybe a little more humbly, maybe a little more with hat in hand, saying, well, maybe we don't need to raise our rates that high, because they know that to get the next 5 years, if that's where we think they should be, or the public thinks they should be, or where they want to be, they need to sort of present a different business model to the city and the public. Like right now, if they get a 20-year deal, what's the incentive for them to change anything about the way they do business? Nothing. It'd be business as usual, same old, just continue to undermine and violate the contract terms, continue to raise rates, continue to have us sort of dependent on this obsolete business model of centralized power. And I feel like a 5-year contract is sort of like a reset button. Like, hey, things are changing. And so I think, I'm not saying it would be immediate impact to rates, just to set expectations. But I think, again, sort of that different mindset, a shift in the dynamic, not only locally, but at the state.
Yeah. I did a Nexus on community choice energy programs record in California, and the record is far more mixed than I think representations are made about it. One of the largest programs in the state is along the Ventura County, northern Los Angeles County line. And some communities have openly discussed withdrawing from it because they haven't achieved the cost savings that they were promised. So do you folks worry that community choice energy is being oversold in terms of what it can actually accomplish? Because state laws dictate so many of the choices about what types of energy are used, that the idea that this will usher in a new green era seems to me to also be overstated.
I'd like to make a comment about that, since I was in the proceeding at the commission in 2018 that dealt with the burden of exit fees that are being pushed on the community choice aggregators. And this is another issue of the California Public Utilities Commission acting as more or less a concierge for the interests of the IOUs, in that they have burdened the customers that are exiting from, say, SDG&E service to San Diego Community Power with heavy departing load costs. And that's the reason that the CCAs are currently having some challenges in beating utility rates. And just for the record, the commissioner who was the head of that proceeding, Carla Peterman, went straight from the commission to head of regulatory affairs for Southern California Edison. That is a tough nut to crack when the California Public Utilities Commission is so overtly favoring the utilities in these excellent programs. Without the burden of that exit fee, the community choice aggregators would be taking off like gangbusters. And so part of this fight is getting the commission to do its job and to allow the community choice aggregators to succeed and not work on the side of the IOUs to burden them with costs. Despite that, the community choice aggregators are still succeeding, but they're fighting with their ankles tied together, with the commission being so overtly in support of the IOU's position.
Yeah, and I guess to me, I mean, you cite one example. I don't know if that's representative, and I don't think you can then make this sweeping statement that the CCEs, are not have not proven to be this panacea that we claim them to be. I mean, it's not just about cost. It's about reliability. It's about transforming our grid to be decarbonized. And these community choice programs have thrived and excelled and are completely changing the market. Like, finally, we're getting investments to not only reduce our gas demand and which is kind of the next frontier of decarbonization, is getting us off gas, but they have invested in, again, this distributed, decentralized model, which is when you talk about wildfires, right? We know we're tinderbox in California. When you're talking about all these outrageous rates, like, we have to become we have to have a local independent energy system, just like water, just like I think one day food. That's where I think the world's headed. Like, we're going to need to figure out like how to become local resiliency. It's going to be pivotal. And so where these entities, in my opinion, are so fundamentally game changing is that they have they're so nimble and innovative, and they experiment and they sort of push the envelope, where these entrenched bureaucratic corporations who are only just thinking about profits, right? That's all their executives, and that's all they're required. That's what the law requires them to do. Like, how do we make money? How do we make money? How do we make money? The opposite is true for these community choice providers, which is how do we make our communities ready? How do we innovate? And how do we continuously act in the public interest? They just have fundamentally different missions. These Wall Street IOUs versus these community-owned choice public agencies, fundamentally different. And thus you're seeing fundamentally different products that are being provided to the community, the IOUs versus what the community choice programs are providing. And so I've just been thrilled with the outcomes of these community choice models. And I don't think anyone has actually left this. I mean, you cited one example of people thinking about it. At the end of the day, there's like 23 existing community choice programs representing over, I think, 10 or 12 million Californians. And, with extraordinary success. And in fact, there's all this new Wall Street credit that they're getting, because they're getting the highest rating from, what do you call that? I'm sure someone knows, like Fitch or something. I don't know. You get credit ratings. Yeah, so you can, borrow money for less, and they're all getting. Wall Street's like, whoa, this thing is working. So, and let me just give a shout out to our local San Diego Community Power, who just announced that they are going to be providing default power with higher renewable energy content, 50% versus SDG&E's 31%, at lower rates than SDG&E. I mean, sorry, that in and of itself, game changing. And they offer a 100% renewable product. That's 100% real renewable energy, no credits. Something people feel very strongly about. This is real renewable energy going on the grid for the same rate as SDG&E. So it's not less, but it's the same. Are you kidding? I mean, like, I don't know how you can't stand back and applaud and say how exciting, like, you know, this is where we're headed. And then just wait until San Diego Community Power starts building their reserve and starts getting the revenues coming in. And then they get to have fun with the programs. Because again, that's the other game changer here. All the revenue that SDG&E is just collecting and, you know, hoarding and giving out to their executives, because we've talked, well, I don't think we've talked here, but, you know, we can talk about the salaries and the profit margins of Sempra and SDG&E. But in lieu of, you know, exorbitant executive salaries, what these community choice programs do, they take those revenues and they reinvest them back into the communities. Like that's where the future lies. You know, that's how we're going to be, again, resilient communities that are figuring out how to sort of navigate this changing world. So I obviously I feel very passionately about it. I fought for it. So I will defend a community choice model to the end of time. But yeah, so just that's my answer to that.
Nicole, you kind of touched on this a little bit, but I want to ask anybody, but you did almost mention it. We're seeing major climate effects on energy availability, wildfires in California, the storms that took place in Texas. How does that change your vision?
Great question. I'll take it for just 1 minute, and then Bill and Joe and Matt. Yeah, it's funny. What it did was really conform to the vision that we've always had at Climate Action Campaign, which again, if we're going to look ahead 20 years and prepare, then we need to, you know, might seem radical, so just take it for what it is, but I believe we need local food, local energy, local water supplies. Like the whole world economic chain is going to be upended. You know, we're all going to be struggling through these extreme weather events and just challenge, you know, our whole, you know, you've seen our coastlines are crumbling. So much is going to change. Like we have to figure out how we protect our communities and provide, right? How do we survive? I think like we just have to get into that sort of mindset. Thus, on the energy, you know, piece specifically, we have to figure out how to, you know, design our system so there's local, small scale, decentralized systems that are reliable. And so when you pair small scale solar systems, whether the rooftop parking lot or, you know, community solar systems, they're paired with storage, and you can have different types of storage. And you know, we have one of the largest battery storage systems in the world. By the way, No Time Mesa, I actually drove down and saw it because I think it's super exciting. That's the future. But like, if we can continue to innovate in that way and build out a local, reliable, clean energy grid, then I think we're setting up, you know, our kids and grandkids to succeed and be able to kind of weather this changing environment. That's my vision. But Bill, Joe?
Well, I think to a more nuts and bolts approach to your question, I think it goes to the heart of the matter where we think as elected officials, speaking on behalf of San Diego families, that we're actually controlling for those factors, identifying those challenges, potential impacts, and how we mitigate for them. And we realize that when we get locked into these long-term franchise agreements, that we really have little ability to actually force any kind of response, that the for-profit incumbent really drives that conversation. There is no doubt that the incumbent has done a fantastic job in terms of fire safety, but all that was done after the last fires. The situation in Texas, I'm sure when anybody does a deep dive into that, we'll begin to realize that a lot of the problems came with for-profit entities who were geared towards investor return on investment or to their shareholders, and focused on that and thought, we'll ride this as long as we can until something disruptive like an extraordinary weather event really calls them on the carpet. And I think that's what we're trying to do. We're the elected officials that have been asked to represent San Diego families to anticipate and react to that kind of thing. And we need more local control. And we're not only negotiating what is really a real estate transaction, but we're going to hopefully embed into that a level of accountability so that, again, with a 5-year contract, as I believe it was Nicole mentioned, we have an opportunity to say, you had a good track record. We're not ready to pivot to public power yet. So we'll give another 5-year. Right now, we just don't have that. And I don't see that being an integral part of a 20-year extension. So again, it is us driving the conversation about what San Diego families need, not what shareholders and investors are looking for in terms of profit, driving the profit.
SDG&E already has a lot of existing commitments to the community. We've already talked about their efforts in wildfire, looking at things like undergrounding power lines in the communities. And I'm wondering, do you have concerns that these commitments won't be kept if conditions change?
Well, I'll jump in and then if someone can follow up on me. I would be careful using the word of commitments for undergrounding. As San Diego families pay for that undergrounding. We give the money to SDG&E, they give it to the city then contracts back to SDG&E. So in that sense, the incumbent really is just a private contractor that is undergrounding lines in our neighborhoods. And there's not a very good track record of that on so many levels, and we can get into that. We have an opportunity. They are a corporate interest. They'll have to decide how they want to behave as a corporation going forward with a 5-year contract. That's going to be up to them. But again, we have to look at the best interest for San Diego families about how we conduct ourselves in this transaction, protect those families, ensure accountability, ensure we're doing the best deal for San Diego.
How this came up in the last or in a last council meeting where a bunch of council members, some of whom are no longer on the council, threw out ideas, right? Like the council president, Georgette Gomez, suggested a 10-year deal with a 10-year option. Scott Sherman, to your point of undergrounding power lines, talked about the deal to not just include cash, but services for such things like that, and EV charging stations. So I guess it's interesting to hear you come in, Joe, and talk about kind of 5 years. And obviously that's quite a far ways apart from where SDG&E is. So I guess, how likely is it that we meet in the middle somewhere? And you're not going to negotiate in public. I'm not asking you to, I don't expect you to, but thoughts on what that menu might include in the middle, and do these issues like the equity fund that the council just approved, like power lines, like charging stations, do all those fold into this, or is it straight negotiation on time and money?
Well, as you know, Matt, we don't know exactly the process going forward. That really is up to the mayor. The previous mayor had a very strict interpretation about how to do the invitation to bid and locked everything in tight. And anybody who responded had to fully agree with every term in that invitation to bid. And the only discussion was this hopeful bidding war that was going to happen in front of the city council. We have not heard how the mayor is going to set this up. As a council member, I can only express my opinions and hope that the mayor and the mayor's office takes those into account. I suspect we'll be saying that invitation to bid show up on the street here any day now, given the June 1st cutoff date. It has been suggested, although not confirmed yet, that it will be an invitation to bid that will get the most responsive bidder, and then there'll be some opportunities for negotiation. And so that will be the opportunity to see where whether we are involved as council members and where my colleagues are. At this point, everybody is throwing their ideas on the table. We heard a very vocal endorsement for the 5-year from my colleague, Councilmember Von Wilpert, the other day at Environment Committee. So there will be opportunities for negotiation. And again, at this point, we're all kind of negotiating with ourselves. So as you suggest, we'll have to see how the process that the mayor identifies plays out and then respond accordingly.
And a quick follow-up on that. June 1st, obviously a 5-month extension from what the prior kind of termination date. Is that enough time as a new council member? Obviously, you're a little maybe more immersed in this issue because of your background than other council members, but new council members, new mayor, again, pretty experienced mayor, but still, is 5 months enough to get up to speed? Should taxpayers and residents expect that you all will be able to make this decision in 5 months?
Well, let's talk about the disappointment of a brand new council member coming in and what we were faced with, and then the mayor as well. We had an incumbent that clearly played hardball with us, as I testified at a council meeting. Not only did they say, we're only going to give you, I think it was actually technically 4.5 months to do this, to try to jam it on us. But they said, by the way, if you don't close the deal by June 1st, we're not going to give you franchise fees anymore. And you may recall that back in January, we were very, very vulnerable, looking at a $200 million shortfall between this fiscal year and the next one. And this is the kind of corporation that we're dealing with that would seize upon that vulnerability and threaten to withhold money. 4.5 months is a ridiculously short amount of time for something that is so important to San Diego. So I think my understanding is the mayor is going to give it his best shot to try to make it happen. And clearly for those of us that were pushing for public power, that isn't going to happen in that short time frame. But we'll see how it plays out and how those negotiations can press out.
And one quick follow-up to my follow-up, since you brought up the federal stimulus. Everyone's excited for that stimmy, but does that change the city's leverage? Does that change the city's bargaining? I mean, the city was in a huge deficit position and now it's flush with cash.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't call us flush, that allows us.
You're getting more than you need to plug your deficit, right?
That's right. Yeah, we still have a structural problem, and that's perhaps a conversation for another time. I think it does give a level of comfort. It is one of the threats that were posed by the incumbent that no longer is on the table any longer. So some of the arguments by their supporters falls away. The fear factor falls away for certain. But I thought that the threat to withhold franchise fees and was a little bit of a hollow threat. I thought the enticement of a upfront fee again showed who was in control in this conversation. It was the incumbent, not the city, and not the elected officials. So I think it really changes the whole dynamics as you suggest, and that's a good thing for San Diego families.
Thanks.
Given the response to the first round of bidding, is it realistic to expect anyone else is going to come in and offer a bid that is capable of beating or even competing with SDG&E, or are we pretty sure we're just talking about SDG&E from here on out?
Well, I'll give a short answer and then I'll look to my colleagues here. I think you're right that we're only going to see the incumbent given the short amount of time that has been presented and what we saw in the last reaction. But I'd be prepared to be surprised that maybe somebody will jump in, but I won't be surprised if the incumbent's the only bidder.
I would think that the only real alternative is likely to be public power, a public option for the city, and that's the real leverage for the city to, when you talk about rates not going up so fast, the real leverage is that San Diego could become a public utility.
Should the effects on poor people matter in making environmental policy? One example is natural gas. It's much less polluting than gasoline and is relatively cheap. Another is the idea that was just brought up about local resilience in food. Harvard economist Ed Glazer says that's crazy, that economies of scale save money for poor people and make a difference in people's lives. The Freakonomics blog also went after the cost implications for poor people and for ignoring how much big ag has gotten better over the last 80 years. Since 1940, we're growing twice as much food on half the property we used to. So I hear these proposals and it almost feels like a religious thing as opposed to a carefully calibrated attempt to get our environment cleaner while not saddling poor people with more poverty.
I'd like to interject just for a moment on that. It's important to know that we have a regulatory history on point of use energy. The state has what we call the loading order. Any new load that has to be met is met with energy efficiency, number one, to the point that we exhaust it and then we move on. Rooftop solar, and I think, Rob, you may have done some articles on this. Every new residential unit is supposed to have zero net energy or meet zero net energy, it has solar power on it. And that's a common sense point of use requirement in California for new construction. Also, under California's energy efficiency strategic plan, we have aggressive targets for converting residential and commercial existing buildings to rooftop solar. And this is our strategy in the state. So I hear what you're saying about mass production and those types of things, but we've developed over 15 or 20 years in California an excellent strategy for dealing with climate change, for resiliency. We just have to implement it. We don't have to create it. This isn't a religious experience. This is what we determined we're going to do, and we're trying to execute it.
And getting back to the point about equity and concerns over communities of concern and low-income folks, natural gas is cleaner than coal. It's also very dangerous, and it's killing people in their homes. So that infrastructure needs to be taken out of our communities. It's increasing the rates of asthma and cardiovascular disease in low-income communities. It's vitally important that we start planning and we start working towards getting this infrastructure equitably out of these neighborhoods and out of our system, not only so that we can protect the climate. I mean, yes, it's a huge driver. Methane gas is 10 times more important than carbon dioxide in terms of creating climate change, but again, it's killing people. So it's a concern of mine to kind of hear like, well, natural gas is a great thing and it's helping people. It's like, actually, it's doing the exact opposite while having a tremendous effect on our climate. And right now, our utility, SDG&E, instead of doing the hard work, or doing the absolutely necessary work of planning to pull this stuff out of our homes and to stop killing people, they are instead doubling down, and they want to make that investment even stronger, and they don't want to change. They don't want to move and do that work. And so for us, it's important for this franchise agreement to be short, for there to be accountability, so that there's an incentive for SDG&E to start moving on that. And to be frank, like the state's headed in that direction because they also recognize that this is a climate issue and it's a public health issue. So, it's an important part of this conversation, and we're definitely going to need to make sure that that's centered, that equity is centered in how we move forward.
Yeah, and I agree to the point that we are not ignoring that. It's not the question of whether, it's the question of how we do that. And we have to think about those that are most vulnerable and less able to meet their own needs. Clearly, climate change is going to impact our lower income neighborhoods, and they have the least resources to combat that on their own. And the question of utility rates are one that we have to be very sensitive to. A lot of these issues will take time to implement. They are not a flip the switch, leave everybody on their own devices. We will be very thoughtful, very careful. And a lot of what the economy has been built on is on the backs of low-wage workers. And that is another consideration that we have to take into account. So it has to be careful, it has to be thoughtful, but the future, I think, is beginning to define itself going forward. And the question is, how do we bring everybody along in an equitable way, as Matt mentioned, going forward? And I know it's something that I'm particularly focused on, and hopefully you've seen that in my council actions here in the first few months, but we will not ignore those at all income levels to make sure that we do this equitably, but we move in this direction.
And I guess my only additional thought, and I agree with everything that's been said, is like, use the example of water. What is your proposal, given our water supply crisis, if not local water supply? Like, where in the world are you going to be importing it from, and how expensive is that going to be? Like, this idea that the world is not changing and that we should just remain business as usual and static, because this mass production has been the traditional way our economy has worked, is just not consistent, doesn't comport with all the science about what a fossil fuel future is going to look like. And so, the reason we have pure water, the reason we have water recycling, and we even have desalinization, is because people recognize that the Colorado River is drying up. Like, we need local water supplies. Well, I would argue, given all the wildfire threats, given what you just saw in Texas when they had, this massive storm, they can't do business as usual. They're also, Texas, I guarantee you, is going to look to local small scale solar plus storage in the same way we are. Like, we have the wildfire threats, and thus we need local independent, local control over energy system, the same thing is going to happen in Texas, because that's kind of what they're seeing now as well. And water supply too. And we've done really well on that. I'm really proud, especially on the water side, how we're doing, and we're moving in that direction on energy. And so, yeah, you can, just assume it's going to be business as usual. I guess I fundamentally disagree. And I believe it's our responsibility to think 20 years down the road about what kids are going to need to be able to survive. And it's going to be smaller scale solutions.
As a follow-up on the cost question, I wondered, while we have you all here, if you have any thoughts to share on the kind of like review and debate going on at the PUC over net energy metering, and who bears the brunt, cost, and burden of solar. I wondered, obviously SDG&E is on one side of that debate, so what your thoughts, if any of you want to take that, on what should happen with that subject.
I would be happy to take that. And the debate outside of this, in your interview with SDG&E, they correctly identified that solar and rooftop solar and storage were causing a decline in their demand, and that's really how they do justify new infrastructure. And so the exponential growth of rooftop solar and storage is a fundamental threat to the business model. That's just the way it is. It's a major change. But this was anticipated when the community choice aggregation legislation was passed in 2002, where the utilities were advised, looking down the road, you can see that some portion of your load is going to depart and form these community choice aggregators. So do not make imprudent investments in gas turbine power plants, in even green contracts. Don't make imprudent investments, because if you make those imprudent investments, you're going to end up with a lot of stranded costs. And so they have made many, many imprudent investments. And without going into the details, if you want the details, we can have a separate conversation about that. But as a result, they're facing a tremendous amount of stranded costs, and they're looking at ways to shift those costs from one customer side to another. But this issue, the red herring, I would call it, is the low-income customers saying that the net metering solar is a toy of the rich, a toy of the well-to-do. The fundamental reason for that is that there are tools available to assure that those low-income renters, poor credit, get solar and batteries just as fast. Things called on-bill financing, on-bill repayment. The utilities have resisted implementing those for good reason, because if you implement that, the idea of inequities are gone, and all of your customers are equally, it's equal access for all customers. It just accelerates undercutting your conventional business model. And so the issue of poor customers not having access is an artifact of the utility treatment of those low-income customers. It's not a fundamental block to giving the equity customers just as much access.
So the government in California has made it clear that electric vehicles are something that everybody, not should just start thinking about, but this is going to become a reality. What would need to happen for local governments to create the infrastructure that's needed to really make that happen in terms of electric vehicles, start charging stations and that type of thing?
Well, I'd say first and foremost, we're going to need a partner that's going to be able to help us build that infrastructure out, be it a private utility or public utility, and we need to not do what SDG&E has been doing with EV infrastructure. They've overpromised and underdelivered. They've overcharged. Most recently, the PUC put out a report outlining SDG&E's performance in the previous cycle of EV infrastructure, and they are egregiously overcharging for it, and the PUC is calling them out on it. They're also under-delivering in terms of their promises for equity on that front. They have not delivered the amount of charging stations in communities of concern that is necessary, and they want to continue to lower that number of EV charging stations in those units, contrary to what state law is saying is necessary. So, fundamentally, these franchise agreements, again, offer an opportunity, if they're short-term, if there is accountability, if there are annual audits and so forth, for the city to say, hey, maybe you shouldn't charge us double for EV charging stations. Maybe they shouldn't be investor owned so that you profit from them. I mean, SDG loves to talk about their EV infrastructure because they make so much money off of it. They can charge a ridiculous amount for it. The CPUC said that's bull, and they make money when people charge on it. So it's very important for us to, when we talk about, electrifying our transportation system, that it is done in an equitable way, that it is done in a way that's cost effective, that's going to meet state law, and that isn't going to just line the pocketbooks of a utility that, just so you know, in 2019 paid $94 million to 39 executives. So, that amount of cash that, is going to their top executives, I mean, could be invested again into our communities to electrify our transportation system and do a whole host of other things. So that's my answer. I don't know if there's additions to it.
Well, I think in terms to your question, Laura, in terms of local government, there's a balance between government and allowing the marketplace to respond. And, I think we have to keep in mind that the electrical vehicles are still a very tiny portion, and we haven't seen much private investment enter the marketplace yet. Now, with some pretty major commitments by the major automakers of shifting their production to electric vehicles because they see the writing on the wall. I think we'll start to see much more private capital come in. Perhaps we'll start to see our local gas stations converted to EV charging stations on a much more frequent basis. And that'll just simply start the dominoes falling, so to speak, that people will get more comfortable investing in electric vehicle. I know I just leased one last month, which I'm not driving anywhere because I'm not going anywhere. But I think that's what we'll start to see. It really has to change the numbers of electric vehicles on the road before we start to see those investments. And I think, government, whether it's the federal, state, or local level, can do what it typically does, which was create the incentives at the early stage to get the momentum going before the private marketplace steps in and starts setting up those electric vehicle stations on a much more frequent locations and basis.
Thank you.
Speaking of driving around less, moving around less, has the pandemic changed your thoughts at all on what our transportation or transit needs are?
Great question.
I know if for me it has certainly it has changed. I'm looking forward to actually working in office, sit down at City Hall. I've only been there a couple of times since I've been sworn in, but I think we're starting to see a sea change. I think the city of San Diego, as a major employer, is starting to see positive results for something that they perhaps were reluctant to try, and we're certainly hearing that from other corporations. That say, hey, we never really wanted to try teleworking or remote working, but it really seems to have been very productive for our employees. And I think we're going to start seeing changes. I think the big question is when people are comfortable riding transit again. But I'm hopefully with the vaccines rolling out and the pandemic hopefully coming under control sooner, that we'll start to see folks get back to using public transit again, especially with some of the fare changes that we're hearing from MTS right now. So I think we'll see some changes going forward. And I think the timing could not have been better, one of the silver linings coming out of the pandemic.
In 2015, the National Academy of Scholars said the U.S. government and other governments around the world should take an urgent look at geoengineering if climate change kept getting worse. If climate change is really a threat to the human race, that seems to make sense to me. But some geoengineering critics make it sound like they don't want a high-tech solution that doesn't require humanity to fundamentally change its ways. So this kind of gets back to the whole environmentalism as religion question. So if we're told that script says we're doomed because of climate change, why don't we take immediate steps instead of taking the ideas of shutting down large sections of our economy? It just seems to me that if this is an existential threat, it's an existential threat, and we should treat it accordingly.
Well, that's a loaded question.
Well,
go ahead, Joe.
No, go ahead, Nicole.
I guess I start with the part we agree on, that the climate crisis is an existential threat. I think where you go from there, maybe depends on kind of your ideology or where you think solutions lie. personally think solutions lie in the past and in kind of community solutions versus high-tech solutions. Does that mean I think technology isn't going to play a pivotal role? Of course not. That's exactly the conversation we've just been having for an hour, is just what the new technology can do to help us prepare and build this decarbonized, climate resilient grid. Obviously, technology is going to be pivotal. Battery storage and renewable energy technologies are essential to meeting our climate solutions. But geoengineering is a whole other can of worms, and I'm not an expert, so I'm not going to get into the specifics because I wouldn't be able to speak to them properly. But I also think there's just a lot of wisdom from sort of how our communities used to be designed and how communities used to be structured, so that there was more communal kind of support and living, and again, sort of locational efficiency. Sort of getting to Christy's question about what the future of transportation is. I think we are going to continue to see us building in the urban communities, as opposed to just, having everybody live far apart from each other and sprawled out, away from resources, away from support, away from kind of just that, I think the vision for where and how we design our communities moving forward. And so I just, geoengineering is it's in the mix. I know there are some billionaires who are very committed to the idea of geoengineering, but at the end of the day, kind of, and again, Scripps doesn't say we're doomed. That isn't really their message, just to be clear, because I think that's not fair to them. What they say is we have to get off fossil fuels. We have to stop burning fossil fuels. And in fact, one of the most world preeminent climate scientists, Dr. Ramanathan, and I'm sure he'd be happy to chat with you. He's just, lives here in our backyard. Says this everywhere he goes, like we have to stop burning fossil fuels. And in fact, he even testified at one of the franchise fee hearings, franchise agreement hearings at San Diego City Hall. That's how passionately he believes we have to accelerate our path off fossil fuels. But at the end of the day, I just think there's multiple solutions. There's no silver bullet, frankly, in any of these ideas. We have to employ probably all of them. But for me, I just think creating these local economies and local communities where people feel more connected and people are sharing resources and solutions is going to be the pathway to kind of, again, a climate safe future.
And I'm sorry, I was just going to add that, I would disagree with the premise that we're shutting down the economy. The economy is evolving. The economy of today is not the economy of yesterday. And it's not going to be the economy of tomorrow. The companies that are at risk are the companies that continue to ignore all the signs that we see and refuse to react to it. But the fact is, we are seeing major corporations that are beginning to see the light. I mentioned earlier about the major automakers. We're seeing oil companies starting to pivot. Those are the companies that historically have been successful, that understood what was coming up and preparing themselves for what was coming next. And that's certainly the conversations that I'm having with folks that are concerned about their jobs. And how long it will take us to pivot. Geoengineering I see as kind of if we really blow this and really don't react in time and we're desperate, then that may be a fallback position. But here's an opportunity, as I've consistently said over the years, with all the kinds of things that we're talking about. These are changes not only important for our environment, for our economy, for our people, but they make for better neighborhoods. They make for a better lifestyle. They make for a better quality of life. And so it is an opportunity to make some positive changes all the way around. And so that's why I'm interested. And as we've said before, we've done some major shifts here in this town, all driven by advocates. Whether it was the pure water push that came about because of environmental advocates that have gotten us to a better place today, whether it is community choice energy, and now we're at another pivot point that we're looking for some substantial changes. We have a great opportunity. I don't want to waste this moment, and looking for a better San Diego.
And just as another note, building a giant air filter out in the desert that sucks up GHG emissions is not going to solve air pollution problems in communities of concern. It's not going to reduce diesel emissions in Barrio Logan. It's not going to stop children and families from getting sick from fracking in the Central Valley. Like, allowing and excusing the fossil fuel industry to continue as business as usual is just going to continue to perpetuate many of the problems that we have. So relying on kind of these technologies, again, it's just going to excuse them to continue to perpetuate these problems.
And just for the record, Professor Ramanathan had a piece in the UT about a month ago. So,
oh, okay, there you go.
Yeah, a good one for anyone listening to find and read. Let me ask you, Nicole, while we got you here, and Joe, I guess this is for you too. We're always talking about how the climate action plan is legally binding. What's your assessment, Nicole, to date on where we are meeting our goals and what might need to change at a big picture level, if not in the nitty gritty, about to meet those legally mandated requirements?
Yeah, I mean, there was just an audit released and it was pretty grim about where the city's at. I mean, the city spent the last 5 years focused on launching community choice energy. And that's great, but they literally, that's all they did. They sort of just put all their investment into that initiative. And while that's an important one and we support it, obviously, they sort of left behind the whole idea of, again, redesigning our streets, reimagining how we grow and develop. Obviously, they didn't even touch zero waste, which you guys just wrote an article, a great article where I learned like the city now has to spend millions of dollars giving all of us green bins and brown bins and composting. They didn't build that compost facility that was planned in the climate action plan. The tree canopy is not where it should be. So the city is going to have to double down and sort of, I think this new mayor, this is, a pivotal moment is we're at a crossroads and the council too, obviously. Like, are we going to prioritize this landmark plan and actually implement it? Or are we taking this piecemeal the way we have been? And it's funny, a lot of folks ask me, well, why haven't you sued the city? Because it is a legally binding document. And we just really wanted, obviously that's the option of last resort always. It's never the way we want to approach change, but obviously it's on the table, but we're counting on this new mayor and council, because it is a new day, to sort of really take a more holistic look and approach. And again, sort of say, we're, unlike the previous administration, we actually are going to prioritize this. We're going to develop a 5-year outlook about what investments are going to need to be made. We're going to plan, prepare for that. We're going to, have a task force within the mayor's office that holds all the city departments accountable, because these are the kinds of just logistical things that need to happen for big cities like San Diego to actually move on a lot of these items. So we have a lot of comments on the audit, and we're going to be holding Joe's feet to the fire on this. But yeah, it's a great question, and we're not where we need to be. That's for sure.
Kind of picking up on Nicole's point, the audit that was released was not very favorable. And I think the best news is that we have a change of leadership with a new mayor and essentially a new council. The past administration had an opportunity to coast on meeting certain GHG reductions without really doing much of anything. State mandates allowed for a lot of savings, the community choice energy that really didn't require any leadership in terms of talking to San Diegans about what was coming up next, allowed them to achieve certain milestones at little cost. And now we're really at a pivot point. And I'm grateful that the makeup of the new council and the new mayor, I think, are ready and willing to be able to do that and to literally change the conversation that says, let's examine everything we do as a city, even the most basic nuts and bolts things. How does it help us meet those climate action plan goals and targets going forward? Some of them are clearly going to be a little bit harder than others. But I think we're at a great place, and I'm very excited about getting started and implementing the recommendations of that audit, and look forward to having those conversations with my constituents and San Diego families in terms of where we're going to lead this city going forward.
Any other final thoughts or questions from the board for our guests? Seeing none, that was a fast hour. So thanks you guys for coming in. We know where y'all live, so we will reach out if we have follow-up questions.
So does SDG&E.
I was just going to make that sketch a statement that scares me. Not from you, but yes, it sounds like a corporation would say that. So, but I would just like to say these are fantastic questions, and to me, I just love when people are in the weeds of public policy. And thank you, editorial board, for caring so much and understanding that this is, you know, a really pivotal contract and a lot is at stake. And so that makes, I'm walking away feeling good. Like, let's get into it. Even, you know, even the question about geoengineering, let's talk. So thank you for hosting us and allowing us to weigh in.
Sure thing.
Thank you. And I'll echo, thank you for the opportunity. The questions were great, and certainly follow up if you need to. But I certainly appreciate the direction that the editorial board is going and the on-point editorials we've seen on a wide variety of topics. Thank you for all those who contribute to that. I think it's good for our city. It's much appreciated.
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate you saying that. And thanks all four of you for taking the time. We'll see you. Take care.
Okay,
Thank
take care.
you.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Stay safe.